right. Well, thanks, Sally. And thanks everyone for joining. I think we've all a little bit familiar with everyone, but just for the sake of introductions, let's go around the Zoom room and introduce yourselves. Please provide your name, the society that you represent, and where you currently work. So I will just, for this sake of ease, I will call on folks as I see them. So Sharon.
Hi, I'm Sharon Demaro. I'm a professor at UT Austin, and I am representing the American Society for Investigative Pathology.
Wonderful, thank you. Eileen?
Hi everyone, I'm Aileen Keating. I am a professor at Iowa State University and I represent Society for Study of Reproduction.
Wonderful, thank you. Laura?
Hi, I am at UT Health in San Antonio, Texas, and the society I represent is the American Association for Anatomy.
Great, thank you. And Maria?
Yes, thank you. I didn't realize I didn't have my camera on. Hi, everybody. I'm Maria Clara Franco. I am an associate professor in the Center for Translational Science at Florida International University, and I am representing the Society for Redox Biology and Medicine. And I see Eric here. How are you?
And that's a good segue. Eric, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Eric Kelly. I'm a professor at West Virginia University. I'm here as part of FASEB leadership. I'm the recent past vice president for science policy.
Awesome, thank you. And Yvette?
Hi, I'm Yvette Seeger. I'm the director of science policy here at FASEB.
And Sally?
Hi, I'm Sally Schwitman. I'm FASEB's Director of Governance and Leadership Development. And so a part of my responsibilities are making sure all of our volunteers are onboarded appropriately and so that you're ready to do your jobs. And I will just say, I had to be on medical leave at the beginning of July. So you did have one meeting before you got onboarded. So I apologize for that. But hopefully this will help you get ready for your upcoming meeting in August and other activities down the road.
Great. And I'm Naomi, Associate Director of Science Policy at FASEB. So with that, I guess we will go ahead and get started. So today's session is going to begin with Sally providing background on how FASEB functions as a nonprofit. And then Eric, having been the past Vice President for Science Policy, having done this before, he'll provide an overview of the SPC committee's charge, their objectives, your responsibilities as a committee member, and then we will review the meeting schedule. We will then go into reviewing how the SPC committee operates within the overarching FASEB governance framework. And then finally, we're just going to go into some member best practices and what resources are available for you as a committee member. So at any point through today's discussion, please use the raise hand function or chat anytime you have a question. It's a small group, so we're all friendly here and we welcome all questions. So with that, I'll pass over to Sally.
Thanks, Naomi. So we just want to make sure that everybody kind of starts with a baseline understanding of what FASEB is. So I apologize to anybody that already knows this information, but please bear with us so we can get everybody at the same level. So FASEB is made up of 22 member societies that represent 110,000 researchers and a vast group of disciplines within the biological and biomedical sciences. So these societies include, but are in no way limited to, immunology, anatomy, molecular biology, developmental biology, genetics, pharmacology. And our societies range in size from several hundred to over 10,000 members. So you can see with that range of disciplines and with the range of sizes, groups like the Science Policy Committee it is very critical that they're operating effectively because we are representing so many different viewpoints. FASEB offers two types of membership. So there's full and associate membership, and it's just to societies. FASEB does not have individuals as members. So all of your societies are full members. And one of the big things that being a full member entitles you to is representation on the Science Policy Committee, as well as our board of directors, our DEAI committee, and our other governing committees at FASEB. Associate membership is passive, and it enables associate member societies to get the information and have access to some of the information that we have as well. So a good example is something that you will do on the Science Policy Committee is develop fact sheets on specific issues. An associate member, because they do not have representation on the Science Policy Committee, won't have input onto what is in that fact sheet, but they will have access to that fact sheet. This is FASEB's strategic plan. You can read the whole strategic plan and look at all the program priorities underneath it on our website. But I think it's important for this purpose to recognize that public affairs is very intentionally listed first on our strategic plan, and it really is the heart and soul of FASEB. Our advocacy efforts in science policy and federal legislation are consistently cited by our member societies as the prime reason why they join FASEB and why they stay members in FASEB. This is a picture of our headquarters building. We are remote first. So I will say though, with the science policy staff should be an asterisk. Yvette is almost always in the office. So she is there. I am mostly remote, and I'm in New Mexico right now. So I'm doing this very remote. But we do have headquarters space that we use for individuals that want to be in an office setting. And we use that space a lot for staff collaboration, and it is also where the space that we use to convene our Science Policy Committee symposium, our board meetings, those sorts of events. I just want to take a few moments to just kind of go over how FASEB makes money to do the things that we do, including science policy. So we generate revenue through publications, membership dues, science research conferences, and society management services. This is really human resources and accounting at this point. FASEB does have 501c3 nonprofit status. That doesn't mean that we are no profit. It just means that any excess revenue that we earn through these activities support our other programs. And the Science Policy Committee, our science policy efforts, our advocacy efforts are one of those programs that all of these revenue generating items sustain and support. Oh, my little button stopped working. So this chart illustrates the impact each of those revenue sources have on FASEB's budget overall. So we put this together a few years ago because we were getting some questions from some member societies, like, don't membership dues just pay for science policy and advocacy efforts? And you can see here that membership dues are red bar. Actually don't bring in a ton of revenue, and it is our science research conferences and our publications that are the big revenue drivers for FASEB. So I think this is helpful as you're getting on a committee like the Science Policy Committee, just to understand if you ever do have to think about FASEB meetings or publications, the reason why is that they are the drivers for those other program areas. And I see Laura has her hand raised.
Yeah, sorry. So the science research conferences, how was this impacted when we stopped having the big annual meeting? Was it impacted, or? Oh,
yeah,
I see a reaction.
So experimental bio, this is a question that comes up a lot. So the experimental biology meeting was not actually the FASEB meeting. FASEB managed it, so it was actually considered one of our society management services. So we got a fee. So, but it was not very much, and it was managing these 6 co-located meetings that made experimental biology. So it hasn't had an impact really on our revenue. I think what we are seeing though is that meeting going away. We get questions like yours pretty frequently. We've been meeting with individuals who sponsor our science research conferences, and there is a lot of confusion like in the field about you know, why did FASEB get rid of its big meeting? And then we have to explain it wasn't actually FASEB's big meeting. It was just we were managing this other meeting. But that is a good question. Any other questions before I move into other areas? Okay. So before I turn things over to Naomi, are there just any additional questions about just kind of FASEB generally, not SPC specific? Okay, great. Then I will turn things over to Naomi to talk about the next few things.
Great, and I think we will move into the SPC charge and objectives. And for that, I think it's appropriate for Eric to go ahead and share a little bit more about that.
Great, thank you, Naomi and Sally. So as you can see, the SPC charter specifies the SPC charge, which is to monitor and advise FASEB's president and board of directors on public policy topics, federal initiatives, and emerging issues to the Federation and its member societies. To accomplish this, the SPC uses a variety of strategies, as you can see from the list. Strategies, sorry. Had something else on my mind there. You can see from the list. We develop position statements on policy issues important to FASEB, and this includes letters and comments to federal agencies in response to requests for information. We also oversee and provide guidance to the 2 subcommittees of the SPC, and those are the Animals in Research and Education Subcommittee, as well as the Training and Career Opportunities Subcommittee. And among other items, we coordinate consensus efforts for the Federation, and this includes organizing workshops and conducting policy analysis. So the membership responsibilities, moving on to your responsibilities as a new SPC member, you each serve as a voting representative. You also serve as a liaison of your member society. So we definitely encourage regular communication with your member society council, as well as rank and file membership about the work of the SPC and how it benefits your society members. Per the charter, we request that you participate in a monthly SPC video, our video calls, at least 75% of the time. And we request that you review the meeting materials beforehand and offer input on the action and decision items for that month. Naomi and the staff liaison sends the agenda packet well in advance for all the meeting materials, and we strongly encourage you to read those before the meeting so that you're ready to fully participate in a constructive way. So what's our next slide? So here's our SPC meeting calendar for 23 and 24. The items in teal are in person, and FASEB will take care of your flight and hotel arrangements. Monthly virtual meetings typically occur on the 4th Tuesday of the month at 4 p.m. Eastern Time and last 1 hour. However, we do not meet in December. Each month, there is a number of SPC actions that must be taken to keep FASEB operating that will then move forward for board consideration. As you can see from the July meeting, We already have an action item on the deck, FASEB proposed response to a request for information from the NIH. Additionally, there are some activities that happen at a prescribed time each year, and these are listed. In October, we will host we always host our annual SPC symposium, because we try to schedule this on the same day as our regularly scheduled meetings, the fourth Tuesday of the month. What we will do is have a meeting in the morning, break for lunch, and then move right into our symposium. We strongly encourage you to go ahead and mark this date now on your calendar. SPC agendas, our regular agendas, will be sent out about 4 business days in advance. You'll get an email from the staff liaison, Naomi, with an agenda packet and everything that you need to prepare for that following Tuesday. It will also send a reminder email the day of the event, which, as we all know, we become very busy, and sometimes things slip through the cracks. So they're very good about reminding us that we have a meeting coming up, as well as getting materials to the SPC committee.
All right, so next we'll provide some information about how and where science policy sits in the overall governance structure of FASEB. So this organizational chart really lays everything out. So as we've stated previously, we have several departments that report directly to the FASEB Board of Directors, and that includes the Office of Public Affairs that you see highlighted with this red arrow. And that's a department that science policy sits into. From a broader perspective, the Office of Public Affairs has 2 branches, the Legislative Affairs team and the Science Policy and Strategic Initiatives. So Eric noted earlier that part of that SPC charge is to consider items that come from the SPC topical subcommittees, and you can see that broken down here. The Animals in Research and Education Subcommittee, as well as the Training and Career Opportunities Subcommittee. For our strategic initiatives, we have our DataWorks program and our Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. So that is where everything sits within FASEB. So on the next slide, it illustrates the leadership within the Office of Public Affairs. Jennifer Zeitzer is the director of the department, and Yvette Seeger is the director of Science Policy, as well as the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the office. Ellen Gua serves as our Associate Director and our point person for all legislative affairs. I am the Associate Director of Science Policy, and LV Banda is our DEAI Program Manager. We also have Nabila Rios, who is our Science Policy Analyst. And as many of you saw from the announcement earlier this week, I'm actually leaving FASEB at the end of the month. So we will be actively recruiting someone else to the team, and Yvette Seeger will kind of slide it back into the role of managing the SPC as well. So I wanted to state that up front, but so that is what the bottom figure there indicates. And then on the next slide, this just illustrates some of the work that we've done in the past year. We've kind of categorized them into resources, policy influence, and some focused projects. Resources can be really wide-ranging. We have fact sheets that we develop that you see here, like Science Policy for Beginners fact sheet that we approved late last year. We also had a Research with Invertebrates fact sheet that was also approved last year. And then we also have a lot of policy influence, and that's where the SPC really comes in handy as well. We answer requests for information, we draft letters to NIH, and those sorts of things are really instrumental in the policy and procedural process. So some examples of RFI responses that we've done in the last year are comments to the Department of Homeland Security on their proposed changes to the H-1B visa requirements, comments to NIH on their proposed guidance for cephalopod research, and it ranges from all sorts of things. So your expertise can really fit in wherever because it's so far wide-ranging. And then finally, we have a lot of partnerships and focus projects. So we recently launched our Idea and EPSCoR webinar series, and we have the second one in that series coming up next week. It's coming up fast, so you can still register. This was actually a follow-on from our symposium from last year, where Eric was really passionate about raising more awareness for funding and support for Idea and EPSCoR states. And so one of the recommendations was, let's create a webinar series to really create more outreach and raise awareness about what these states are doing through this federal program. So another thing I'll also say is we frequently collaborate with federal agencies and other scientific societies on different science policy topics. So recently we had a USDA cooperative agreement on a specific policy that they issued a couple years ago, and we're currently drafting a final report for that. So FASEB is doing a lot of different projects, and we rely on the SPC for quite a lot of things. But each of those action items then get approved to the board. So once SPC considers them, that then moves forward for board approval. And now I will pass things back over to Sally to describe science policy's role within and the relationship with the board.
Sorry, I was muted. Before I jump into these items, were there any questions about anything Naomi just described? Okay, great. Okay, so we'll start just talking about FASEB's committee structure. And this slide illustrates our hierarchy. And so as you can see, the board of directors is at the top. So the FASEB's board of directors is our fiduciary body. So they are the only group that can make decisions on behalf of the organization. So we'll talk about this more on the next slide, but just keep that in mind. So we do not want the board to do everything, and they cannot. And committees like the science policy committees are really where we consider our subject matter expertise to lie. And so everything that you do is critically important, even though the board has to have that final say so on things that are on behalf of the federation. But we do stress, and we share the same slide with the board as well, that the Science Policy Committee is the subject matter experts. The board is the fiduciary for the organization. And so we want those two things to coexist, and for both bodies to be respectful of those things. You can see kind of how our subcommittees they report to the committees. So the subcommittees that we've talked about, animals and research, training and career opportunities. And we do also have task forces. Task forces are for items requiring attention within a specific time frame. So we currently have a working group integration task force that's overseeing these working groups that we set up. And then we also have a generative AI task force happening right now. And at FASEB, task forces usually only exist for about 12 months. And so this slide is to kind of put a little bit more context to how the Science Policy Committee works within the greater governance context at FASEB. So as you've already seen at your July meeting, and as you'll see in August, you're gonna do a lot from developing programs, responding to agency requests for information, and drafting comments to proposed regulations and legislation. This slide illustrates how SPC work reaches the board. And so, as I mentioned before, the board serves as the fiduciary for FASEB, and thus must provide approval for any action that's made on behalf of the organization. So keep that in mind as we talk about this slide. So we have issue identified is the very first thing. And for the Science Policy Committee, and Naomi and Yvette and Eric can jump in here, but this is often somebody on our science policy team spots in the Federal Register something that FASEB needs to write comments on, or we get a request to respond to an RFI from a federal agency. That's the issue identification. This can also come up when any of you, if you're seeing something happening in the community that you think FASEB should respond to, that is very appropriate for you to bring up. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit more about the best way to go about doing that. After the issue is identified, and you'll notice the items in teal are what we consider staff and volunteer roles. Then the staff and the volunteer leaders, specifically in this case, it would be Mike Lehman, our current vice president for science policy, would work very closely with Naomi, Yvette, Nabila, to figure out how we are going to tackle that issue. This is the point where we talk about, should we involve one of the subcommittees? Do we need to get board input earlier on? So we can take a variety of tracks in that way. Then we get into our phase, and this is where the SPC is their sole responsible for this, is to really deliberate what that recommendation, what that response will be, what that initiative looks like. It's when you're really hashing out the details. And finally, once there's a finished product, the Science Policy Committee will endorse it. And that can, oftentimes for committees, that means they recommend approval of an RFI response to the board, or they recommend approval of FASEB's proposed draft response to a rule coming down the pipe, something like that. But it will be a recommendation. The Science Policy Committee can't act on behalf of FASEB, only the board can do that. So then it gets to the board, which is that black rectangle, and the vice president for science policy, or if they can't do it, we'll have the vice president elect, will present that item, that statement, and to the board. And when they present it to the board, we hope that the board has done their due diligence by reading the item beforehand. But the important things for the board to know are, what process did the Science Policy Committee undertake in drafting that response, those comments, etc., and what stakeholders were involved? Did a subcommittee look at it? Those sorts of things. Because we don't want the board to rewrite the work of the committee, or we often say we don't want the board to relitigate committee work, but the board to do fulfill their fiduciary responsibility of care to FASEB. They need to understand the process that was undertaken to come up with one of these items. Finally, as soon as the board has approved an item, it is the staff's responsibility to make sure that's disseminated. For Science Policy Committee items, and Naomi and Yvette can talk more about this, that's when we send it to the agency, or we post it on our website, or we do a combination of both, or we send a letter to Senate staff. That was something that just happened after the August board meeting, from items that came out of the July SPC meeting. So that's kind of how the process works. One thing to note is, even though there's a straight arrow, this process usually is not that linear. I think recently we had the letter, or it was a response to an RFI from, was it a senator or a representative? And if we were trying to map that out here, it went to the board for their feedback before it went to the SPC, and it went back and forth a couple times. Sometimes we'll involve all the executive officers of FASEB meet once a month, so sometimes we'll get their feedback on something before it goes. So it's not always this linear, and we like to tell the board and the committees, the board shouldn't really be surprised by anything. They should know, have an idea of what the committees are working on. And then also, if there is something, and this does happen with SPC items, sometimes we have to get comments in that do not follow the normal board schedule or SPC schedule. Sometimes we're asked to sign on to a letter that is speaking to an issue that FASEB has already made a public statement about. In those cases, we can have the FASEB's executive committee approve those sorts of actions. And the executive committee tends to meet weekly. They'll cancel if we don't have any action items, but the executive committee will only approve things that are in line with previously approved board positions. If there's something, and this has only happened a handful of times since I've been at FASEB, something happens that it's just time is of the essence and the executive committee has to deal with it. We will let the entire board know right away if they have to make any of those decisions, and it will be a discussion item at the next board meeting. And if it's something involving the Science Policy Committee, we will also inform the Science Policy Committee at that time too, if the executive committee had to take such an action. Thank you, Naomi. I was like, yes, those are the good examples of when we have to get the executive committee's feedback on things. Okay, so before I jump into this, I'll just go back to this slide. Are there any questions or comments about this process? We did start including this information in onboarding because we were getting feedback in some of our volunteer assessments and specifically Science Policy Committee members, they do so much work, just wanting to better understand how that work fit in and related to the work of the board of directors. Okay. So you're going to have to listen to me for a little bit longer. We're going to discuss our volunteer code of conduct and describe the volunteer staff relationship. So we do have a volunteer code of conduct. It was adopted by the board in 2023. And it is based on a model created by the Society's Consortium in Sexual Harassment in STEM. This is a group that was formed, I'm looking at a vet, but I just presented this to another group and I said in 2018, I think that date is correct, but you can tell me if I'm wrong. But the Society's Consortium in Sexual Harassment in STEM, FASEB has played a big role in that group, and they've just done a lot to propose model policies such as this that just ensure that scientific societies are places that are inclusive and welcoming and accessible to everyone. And you'll notice if you read the document that the language speaks to aspirational conduct rather than outlining prohibited behavior. So we use language like, we value honesty in the conduct and attribution of our work rather than don't plagiarize. And I won't read this slide in detail, but you should know it applies to all FASEB volunteers in FASEB associated activities. And the little asterisk is there because there is a clause in the code to also apply to conduct that happens outside of the FASEB realm. Any conduct that may negatively impact that person's ability to be a productive volunteer at FASEB. So the provisions of the volunteer code of conduct are not very surprising. We list our standards of conduct. You will receive an annual disclosure probably within the next week that asks you to acknowledge that you've received, read, and understand and agree to abide by the code. The volunteer code of conduct also lays out the procedure for dealing with non-financial conflicts of interest. And so this will be helpful. If there's any time when FASEB or the Science Policy Committee is debating an item that you feel like there's no way that you could be unbiased, that's when you need to look at this policy to determine when to deal with that. For our board of directors, our finance committee members, and our audit committee members, since they are fiduciaries for the organization, they actually have to complete a financial disclosure, financial conflicts of interest disclosure every year. But so this is a little bit different. And then finally, the code does lay out how to deal with alleged violations, including who you should be in touch with, and what will happen after that point if you see anything anything that you feel is in violation of the code. Okay, are there any questions on the code of conduct before? And I will just say, if you're volunteer for FASEB in any other, Eric is somebody that he's on a number of committees. You'll only have to sign this disclosure once per volunteer year. So, okay. So this slide, we just want to lay out and make sure everybody's on the same page with what's a staff responsibility and what's an SPC member responsibility. And we feel this is helpful just so everybody's aware from the get-go. But just do know if at any time you have any questions about is this an SPC thing? Is this a staff thing? Please feel free to ask me at any time. Eric or Mike Lehman are wonderful resources for this as well. And Beth Garvey, FASEB's current president, are always good resources for any issues coming up with your roles and responsibilities. So FASEB staff and volunteers have complementary but very distinct roles. FASEB staff are responsible for facilitating logistics necessary for the Science Policy Committee to achieve their objectives. This includes scheduling, working with committee leaders to draft meeting agendas, maintaining rosters, and ensuring the committee is working within FASEB's governance and strategic framework. All of FASEB staff, so me, Yvette, Naomi, we report to FASEB's executive director and CEO, which is Frank Krause. So committee volunteers, so on the SPC member side of this slide, with the support of the staff liaison, which right now is Naomi, but it will be Yvette. I'm going to say unfortunately only because we're sad to lose Naomi, but you are in very, very good hands with Yvette come September 1. But you are responsible for meeting the objectives for the Science Policy Committee with the assistance of the staff liaison. And for the Science Policy Committee, it's much more than the staff liaison. It's the other staff in OPA, as well as the board of directors and other individuals at FASEB, because it is such a core component of FASEB's mission. You, as I mentioned before, you are the subject matter experts, and we want you to focus on the science. So we really do hope that staff are doing all of the things that could take your attention away from the science, and that you get to focus on the interesting stuff. But committee members report to volunteer leadership. So for the Science Policy Committee, this is Mike Lehman and Eric Kelly, as well as FASEB's presidential line, which is Beth Garvey, Marianne Bornstein, and Eric Kelly is also our president-elect, so he's there as well. And so what we like to say is volunteer to volunteer, staff to staff. So if at any time you have an issue, your first place to go is the volunteer leadership. And if you have an issue, like you have an issue with a FASEB staff member, you should bring that up to volunteer leadership, or you can talk to Frank Krause about it. But what we want to avoid is having volunteers complaining about staff to other staff members, or staff complaining to volunteers about maybe other volunteers or staff member. That's when every time I've seen situations like that at a nonprofit, it usually means there's a lot of issues going on. We want to avoid that. So volunteer to volunteer, staff to staff. And there are sometimes, and we'll talk about this on the next slide a little bit too, that you, if ever you forget about this, it's no problem. But what the staff are trained to do is that if you got in touch with Naomi tomorrow and said, hey, I think the SPC should do something about blank, you would probably get an email from Naomi that would say, oh, thank you, that's a great idea. I'm copying Mike Lehman and Frank Krause to let them know this issue is coming up. And then Mike and Frank would determine, do we have the staff bandwidth, do we have the resources, et cetera, to tackle that issue. So these are a little silly discussion questions, but just trying to illustrate the ideas that we just talked about on the previous slide. So we don't really have to discuss them, but I'll introduce the concepts. So in the first one, SPC member Chris is very concerned about new laws prohibiting, oh, I think we were supposed to say, oh, I know, that got changed. That should be DEAI concepts into university curricula. I don't know of any new laws that are prohibiting SPC concepts into university curricula. But anyway, so Chris is very concerned about this. And what should Chris do to encourage FASEB to issue a statement about this? And so the appropriate answer there is, and Chris has a variety of ways to deal with this. So first, at every SPC and every committee and board meeting at FASEB, we always have the end of the meeting is reserved time for what we call open mic. That is a great place for this committee member to say, hey, is anybody else seeing this, these rules about no DEAI at their university? That's a wonderful place to bring it up. All the staff are taking notes and aware of what are happening during open mic, and they can then take that item and then figure out what next steps need to happen and whether to address it. Chris should also feel comfortable contacting any of the volunteer leaders about this issue, and they should also feel comfortable contacting Frank Krause to talk about this. So in the second part of this, Chris chose a different option and decided to contact the SPC manager directly and say, we should do something about this. And when the SPC manager doesn't respond to Chris, Chris is upset. And how should Chris proceed? And basically, Chris should just sit tight. What I am very confident in saying about the FASEB staff is that comment did not go into a void. The SPC manager has been trained to escalate that issue to the volunteer leadership, to Frank Krause, to determine how we are going to tackle that issue. And in some instances, it's to have the conversation, is this really something for FASEB to tackle or not? And if at any time, and I will say everybody is very responsive on the FASEB staff, so Chris should expect to receive an answer within a few days saying, oh, thank you for bringing this up, we're going to deal with it this way, or thank you for bringing this up, but we don't feel this is an appropriate thing for FASEB to do right now, ever, whatever, and with some reasoning behind that. But we do have these discussion questions here. We have them more in the board onboarding, just for people to understand the appropriate mechanisms for raising issues that they would like a committee or FASEB as a whole to address. Are there any questions about this? Okay. So in addition to our responsibilities explicitly laid out in the SPC member position description, that these are some ones that maximize governance effectiveness. So we do encourage you to engage with your society. When you get the SPC agenda every month, if there's anybody you can talk to at your society about trying to figure out like, well, how does my society feel about this issue? Or some of our member societies, not all, have public affairs or science policy committees themselves, and you can make sure that your viewpoint is of the society is accurate. We also encourage you to, when the Science Policy Committee makes decisions on something, to also communicate that back to your society. Because FASEB is a federation, we do not have direct access to the independent members of your society. So we really do depend on our volunteers who we can contact directly to help disseminate information on behalf of FASEB. We also ask that you are present when you are on conference calls. Please use your video, especially when we understand you can't do this at all time. I do think video is incredibly helpful if you're asking questions or if you're trying to share an opinion. Also in this virtual world, I think it's wonderful, a wonderful way for us to be able to connect with each other and start to build some relationships with people that may be geographically pretty far away. Limit distractions. Again, we understand in a virtual world it's hard to do, but we ask that everybody be mindful of the distractions. We do encourage and promote the use of inclusive and gender affirming language. LV Banda, who is our DEAI manager, is a wonderful, wonderful resource. If you have any questions about what the inclusive language is, things are changing, and we are all open to asking the question of what is the more inclusive way to address something. Also use the technology. We use Zoom. Please use the raise hand function, the chat, any of those sorts of things to limit interruptions. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, now I'm going to turn things back over to Naomi.
All right, so this slide does a great job showing all the different resources that FASEB offers for science policy. Most importantly, our science policy and advocacy webpage, which is directly linked here. And you can click through any of our priorities that you see in this snapshot here, and it will take you to all the different subcategories and all the resources, webinars, fact sheets that we've done on these topics. We also have a Washington Update bi-weekly newsletter that we encourage you to subscribe to. The link to subscribe is included in the monthly agendas as well. And we give updates on things like federal advisory committee meetings, upcoming events, new policies that are proposed to the federal agency. So it's a great way to stay in tune with what's going on in science policy, because we recognize you all have very busy jobs and you may not be able to do so. So we provide that service to you. And then the MemberClicks website takes you, that's your volunteer portal. So go here for all things related to like governance and scheduling. And this lists all of FASEB's committees, their charters, and every other information that you might want to know about FASEB. And then finally, we have direct links to a lot of recent reports that we've done. We have one on early career researchers. We have a promotional toolkit for that if you want to find ways to tweet about it or spread the word. And then last year, we also published an animal research activism report and how institutions, researchers, IACUCs, the steps that they can take to protect themselves from animal rights activism. And of course, follow us on all things social media to spread the word about the work FASEB is doing. And I believe the last slide here is just your key SPC contacts. And these are, you will find that their email addresses and everyone that you should go to. Of course, your first points of contact should be the chair and the vice president for science policy, so Mike Lehman here, and our vice president-elect for science policy, Joe Yost. For logistical matters, those should be directed to staff. So Yvette Seeger, Jennifer Zeitzer, and Ellen Gua if you have a legislative question. But we all work together very closely, so you are always in good hands, and we communicate back and forth quite a bit. So that's, I believe, everything we had. I'll turn it back over to Sally.
Yes. So before we adjourn today, are there any questions about any of the information shared? I know it's a lot. We will record this and we will post it online for you to look at. And in addition to the OPA staff, I am always happy to take any questions. And if there's at any point you're ever confused about who to get in touch with for a specific question, I'm usually a good place to start there, and I can kind of map you to the right person.
So Sally, I'd just like to interject just for a second and say welcome to everybody. If I had two pieces of advice to give you, would be get ready to roll up your sleeves and also get ready to be amazed by the variety of different topics that come up, amazed by the depth and experience of the staff, and just how many ways in which you can plug in. And then please take this back to your societies and communicate the value that FASEB is actually injecting into their membership. So welcome and get ready to have a lot of fun.
I think I would also just mention, and this was in the presentation, but just to draw out again, that our first in-person event it will be here before we know it. So that Science Policy Committee Symposium on October 22nd. I believe we will start sending a registration form out for that shortly, but if you want to mark your calendar now, that would be great. Once you let us know whether or not you will be able to attend, and instructions on how to book airfare and hotel and all those things. Other than that, I just want to thank you for your time today. I know it's a lot of information. I know it's not the most exciting information, but I do think having this information makes the rest of the process more fun, like Eric just alluded to.
I did kind of have a quick question. How are we going to be assigned to the different subcommittees? Are we going to be assigned? No, not okay.
No, we have, it allows us to branch out to other volunteers. So you will get the work from the subcommittees. So it used to be a process way back when I started at FASEB. We had about 7 or 8 subcommittees, and the practice was to have each SPC member serve on at least 1, if not 2 subcommittees. But it was one of my problems that I had with that is that it became a bit of an echo chamber, that you were ratifying your own decisions. And so we've made a conscious decision to not only streamline the subcommittees, but also give the opportunity to engage other researchers from the member societies, so that we're getting that breadth of perspective that goes up to the board of directors, so that we're really amplifying those voices instead of echoing.
That's really smart. We have similar issues right now with the committee I'm on AAA. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And I'll just,
just want to think.
Sorry. I just want to address the elephant in the room. This presentation is happening at an awkward time. So Naomi will be the liaison for the August SPC. And then you will get a separate appointment with my Zoom on it when I take over in September. So apologies for that sort of transition, but it should not affect your user experience, except that you'll have to update calendar appointments.